Welcome to the Prison Pod, a podcast for all people experiencing incarceration. The mission of this podcast is to save lives, restore hope, reduce suffering, and recidivism. Many show ideas come directly from the listeners, so please write the host. Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine, 04473. Here is your host, Ms. Valerie.
Hello, and welcome to Season 4 of the Prison Pod. Today we will be talking about the historical links between slavery and mass incarceration. Eric Seiferth is joining us to talk about an exhibit called Captive State, which is currently at the Historic New Orleans Collection through January 19, 2025. We will look at the past race-based systems of New Orleans that led to the domestic slave trade and how this developed into the mass incarceration that we are familiar with today. I would like to welcome...
Well, hi, Valerie. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to get to share a little bit about the work we've done in the project we have on display, Captive State, down here in New Orleans.
Can we start with a little bit of history of where this exhibit begins and how it develops through its stages? I know that's a lot, but...
Well, of course. And I'll try, there's plenty to talk about. So let me start with a higher level, kind of broad strokes, chronological introduction. And then maybe we can explore some of the different themes and historic moments a little bit more. But to orient the listener, we tell the story of incarceration in Louisiana, starting with really the founding of the city of New Orleans in 1718, up through the 20th and into the 21st century. This takes us from the colonial era in Louisiana, when it was French and then Spanish, up until the 1800s, where it becomes American. And it's at that point that the city becomes the center of the domestic slave trade in the United States. And this is important for the show, and it's important for American history. And incidentally, I'm excited to be talking with you today, and maybe we could talk a little bit about how this story, which is about New Orleans and Louisiana, is really about American history and really has reaches outside of the state and the city, and impacts the whole country. But about 200 years ago, New Orleans was the center of the domestic slave trade in the United States, which means that more people were bought and sold in the city than anywhere else in the country. And that had profound implications on the development of systems of incarceration, many of which were designed to reinforce the forced captivity of enslaved people in the city. It also had profound implications on the economy in the United States as a whole. By some counts and estimates, the sale of people, not their production, whether that be cotton or sugarcane or whatever, but the sale of people was the largest economic driver in the United States for a number of years prior to the Civil War. So that was happening on a wide scale in New Orleans. We get into the 20th century and we try to see where the kind of historic connections from the history in the 17 and 1800s bleeds into the 20th century. And then we look at the moment of dramatically increased incarceration that happens in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and try to see how we got there. So that's in kind of broad strokes the outline of the exhibition.
When you talk about this, are you talking about incarceration in general, or mostly persons of color that are affected by incarceration?
We're talking about incarceration in general. In Louisiana and New Orleans and the United States, people of color, Black Americans, are disproportionately affected by incarceration. So, and that's especially so in New Orleans and Louisiana. So that part of the story is a big one. And it impacts incarceration generally because it impacts how incarceration takes place. But we tell the story, broadly speaking, of punishment. From the French era, when punishment is based on physical violence. It's not based on serving time in a prison, that affects people of African descent and European. And we look at how that changes over time, and how people of different races are affected through all the centuries up until today.
Can you tell us why it's important that people learn about this subject? Because it seems to me it was a piece that was left out of my history books.
It wasn't in mine either. It's an important part of our culture. It's an important part of our daily lives as Americans, certainly as Louisianians, and that being incarceration. And it's an important part because so many people are affected. The United States incarcerates almost, more people than almost any other country in the world. Depending on the year and the way you count, it's number one, or they're right up there. Our data shows about 624 people incarcerated per 100,000 in the United States, which is way above, a lot of similar countries where, like more than twice places like Canada, Mexico, way above any place in Europe. And even above the reporting, which is what we can go by, of places like Russia and China and Brazil. And so it affects everyone, right? In Louisiana, 1 out of every 100 person is incarcerated. So it's hard not to find people who have a direct experience of incarceration or know somebody close to them who has. So it affects us in such a immediate way that I think it's important that we look at the history of its development and why it is the way it is. We also pay a lot of money as Americans to make this system exist. In Louisiana, the current state budget allocates just shy of $1 billion for the Department of Corrections. So as taxpayers, maybe I don't know anybody that's been incarcerated, but as a taxpayer, I'm paying a lot of money for this. So, I think there's a lot of reasons that it's really important for us to be aware of how incarceration works. And I think to do that, I'm a historian. So the way I learn about things is I try to figure out, how did we get here? Let's look at what happened in the past. So we hope that, that's kind of our role as a museum focused on history, is to help give people that historic context to relevant topics so that we can be better informed, have better conversations, take ownership of how this, enormous system operates.
Speaking on history, could you speak a little bit on the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which abolished slavery except as a punishment for a crime?
Yeah, well, you hit the important part there. Excuse me. After the Civil War, we passed a series of amendments. The United States does, right? The 13th, 14th, and 15th, designed to end slavery and make Black Americans full citizens, essentially, are the goals of those amendments. But they have this loophole for slavery, servitude, for those duly convicted of a crime. In a big picture, what that means is that our United States Constitution allows for certain types of enslavement today. Practically speaking, I think what you saw, especially coming out of the Civil War with convict leasing and the development of prison plantation systems, and continued forced labor into of incarcerated people through to the present day, that there is a legacy of forced labor that predates the Civil War and is constitutionally permissible. And I think it's important when we learn about those, amendments that we learn what they do and what they don't do.
Was there something that you learned that stood out to you during this project that you didn't know beforehand?
It's a great question. I mean, we've been working on this. It took us about a half a decade, a little bit more than that, and a good portion of those years were, really focused on research. So I'm a public historian of Louisiana. I'm not a historian of incarceration. So what that means is I had to spend a lot of time learning. And I knew a lot of the kind of higher level concepts of what we were going to see. I expected to see this connection with the slave system. I expected to see disproportionate effect on people of color in the state. I'm aware of how all these things play out in different situations. What I didn't know, I guess, were the degrees to which, or the connections, how strong the connections were. I learned things every day through this process of working on this exhibition and seeing how close the ties to the slavery in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, especially in the development of the systems of incarceration. I expected to find something there. I didn't know what it would be. And that's really, I think, where you see, and what we have in our exhibition illustrates this deep kind of fundamental relationship. And I'll give you an example. In 1805, the city is newly American. And the mayor says we are in a country of slaves. And what he means is there are a lot of enslaved people, and they need to be controlled to maintain the system of white supremacy. In 1808, the city begins its first municipal police force. And that same year, they institute a system of a police jail. And the two come directly out of Saint-Domingue. And Saint-Domingue is now known as Haiti. And a lot of Haitians came over to New Orleans following the revolution there. And in short, the police force was founded in large part by people from Saint-Domingue who worked to catch escaped enslaved people in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue, were forced out during the revolution, came to New Orleans and restarted the same system, along with police jails, which were designed as extrajudicial places of detention for enslaved people that had escaped enslavement and been caught, or for enslaved people whose enslavers wanted them to be punished but didn't want to do the punishing. They would send them to the police jail to be physically tortured or forced to work. And it's out of these jails that we see the development of the chain gang. Chain gang is something I think a lot of Americans are familiar with. We have movies and popular songs where we reference the chain gang and this element of forced labor. And it comes from the Caribbean into New Orleans, and from New Orleans to the rest of the United States. And we actually have on display the first known image of a chain gang, and it dates to about 1820. It's in the New American neighborhood of New Orleans. And what you see are 3 enslaved men wearing chains working on city street maintenance, and enslaved woman with what's called a runaway collar on, which is a iron collar with 3 large spokes that extend from her neck up to above her head. And she's working on cleaning gutters. And what complements this image and this story are the existence of hundreds of receipts between the city and enslavers for work done by enslaved people on the chain gang, or to enslavers to the city for housing an enslaved person that escaped, along with a surveyor's day book that lists every day where all the work happening in the city was, and every day where the chain gang was. So this deep relationship, I wasn't aware of all these specifics that really lay bare how much the two systems relied on each other, and how they ended up developing and impacting not just practice in New Orleans and Louisiana, but across the country. Like I said, the chain gang is something we all know about, but this is where it derives from. And it's impacted thousands of Americans as a form of punishment through forced labor. And we kind of see where that comes from. So that's an example of something that really kind of struck me that I learned through the process.
It's so hard to comprehend how one race of people decided that they were over and above another race of people. We were all human beings, and the only differences were our skin color. And to see those divisions still happening today through race, it's very sad to think that over all these years, we haven't come further than we have.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, it is very sad. And I think, there's this legacy of colonialism in the United States that is based on setting up societies that are white supremacist societies. That's what French colonial Louisiana was. It enslaved and had superiority over everybody else. It's hard for us to, there has to be a reckoning with this history. There has to be an understanding of what it was, I think, for us to move forward. And so I think that's partly our job is to educate and be talking about what that history was and looks like. And, we all know how it impacts us today, but what did it look like? What was the past like? Why was it that way? And how did it get us to where we are?
I think that's why exhibits like this are so important for people to go and see, because it is part of history that most of us have not heard about. I mean, we hear little bits and pieces, but as you know, a lot of our true American history has been slid under the rug and covered over. We've seen this with what happened in residential schools. We've seen it with slavery. We've seen it today with incarceration. What's going on in our prisons today is still pretty barbaric when you want to take a look at death penalty and life without parole sentencing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the exhibit has been open just a little over a month.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you've heard about the feedback. Yeah.
So far, we've had pretty good feedback. Most of who I've talked to are kind of project stakeholders who helped us. We had an advisory board for the project that included people with experiential, practical, and academic knowledge of incarceration. And their responses were all really positive, and that was very meaningful for me and for our team. And, our outreach during the curation of the show extended further than that board. And we've had the chance to take a lot of people through who, I may have met or we may have worked with 3 years ago. And we're like, yeah, we're working on this project. And then you don't see them for a while. And all of those responses have been really good. So that's very encouraging. Summer's also, for those of you who have been in New Orleans in the summer, it's very hot here. And it's our slow season. So I'm excited to get around the corner and get more visitation and see kind of what people have to say. But it's been very positive. We do have a response, 2 opportunities for response from visitors in the gallery. One is just an open-ended share what you want to share in a book. And those have been very positive. And, I think a lot of people have shared that they were shocked at the specifics. They didn't, weren't prepared to, or hadn't been taught, kind of like what you said. This wasn't in history class when I was in grade school. But I'm glad that I know now. So we've gotten a lot of that. And then we have another opportunity for visitors to answer a question. If you could change any part of incarceration in Louisiana, where would you begin? And those are interesting too, because they're in a moment where we see visitors talking about investing in other things, where they talk about kind of, looking at the sources of inequality and crime and racism and inhumanity in general in our society, in ways we can kind of maybe get past those. So those are interesting to read, and there's been a lot of participation by visitors on that board as well.
That's great. And I wish if you would just one more time tell people where they can find this exhibit.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for giving me the chance. The exhibit is Captive State, Louisiana in the Making of Mass Incarceration. It is free to visit. We're in the heart of the French Quarter in New Orleans at 520 Royal Street, and we're open every day but Monday. If you want more info about it, you can go to hnoc.org. That's our webpage, and there you can see information about this exhibition and other exhibitions that we're doing. And I also want to share that we have a special tour for this exhibition. It's a 90-minute tour, and which is a good long tour. But what's special about it is that we lead the visitor through conversation. So it's designed to encourage group learning through talking to each other. So the staff member, the tour guide, kind of leads the group to a handful of objects, and they talk about them and talk about the content of the exhibition and hope to kind of grapple together with the big concepts of things like forced labor and inhumane treatment and things like that. And visibility, which you mentioned too, about how so much of what's going on in our prisons is invisible. Visibility is one of our themes as we track kind of this highly visible punishment of the colonial era, which is meant to be visible, to today when it's really been put further and further away from the public eye. And I think that's, it's harder and harder to know what's happening in our jails and prisons. So the conversation can go in any of those directions. And what's really neat about it is that each tour is different. And instead of having me or someone like me talk at you for an hour, you get to talk to your group, which could be, the people you're with, but it could also be whoever else signed up for that tour. So there's an opportunity to just have a conversation with people on the topic. So those are offered, I believe, Thursday through Sunday from 10 to 11:30.
I love that idea because we learn so much from each other. And when we have those open conversations, that's how we change people's minds when they're maybe not quite in the right mindset they need to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you learn so much. I mean, we've done a lot of practice ones and with staff, and they've just been really meaningful for everyone, I think, to get the opportunity to talk and to listen to each other. It's a cool thing. It's the first time we've done this at the museum. So we're excited about it.
Okay, well, I have one last question, and this is a personal one. I like to ask everybody, is there a book, it can be a true book, a fiction book, self-help, whatever, that really stood out to you in life that might have been a life-changing book?
Oh, what a question. Oh, man.
Put you right on the spot.
Yeah, right. Man, I want to hear your other guest answers. That's a tough one. I mean, I read, there's a lot of, it's like, where should I begin? So let me think for a second. I'll say, I'll start by equivocating and say there's no way to give an honest answer because, it's who knows. It's hard to interrogate that. question because there's so many books that I've read and life moments. Maybe it was Goodnight Moon when I was a kid. I don't know. But I think that my final answer will be a book I read as a student when I was studying history that I think really informed and got me excited about doing history and about ways to tell stories. And that is a book called The 1960s by Todd Gitlin. And he, goes into depth on the development of kind of the counterculture and protest movements during that decade. And I still work a lot on the civil rights movement now in New Orleans, specifically when I'm not working on incarceration. So that'll be my answer for today.
That's
Todd
a good
Gitlin's,
answer.
yeah, Todd Gitlin's The 1960s.
Yeah. There's some people that are prepared. If they've listened to some of the podcasts, they know I always
They know,
ask that
okay.
question.
Yeah, well, you caught me.
But I always like to catch people off guard on that one because, you
That's a
can't
great
be
question.
too prepared all the time.
No. No. Well, that's a great question. Yeah.
Hey, is there anything that I might have left out that you wanted to add in before we wrap things up?
I think I'll just say that I think I kind of briefly mentioned, to me, I think, New Orleans history is a really important part of American history. I think it really impacts American history in ways that we as Americans sometimes overlook. And I think this is certainly one of those moments where the development of incarceration, sadly, really is impacted nationally by the New Orleans story and what's happening in New Orleans, what's happening with the slave trade, which, as I said, was one of, if not the largest economic drivers in the country, and in Louisiana. And that history is one that we need to understand as a country. So it's not, I hope anyone who comes to the show or might listen to the podcast, thinks, I encourage listeners to think of this as a window into all of our shared history rather than a window into a unique history far away, because I don't find that to be the case.
Very good. You came up with some really great answers today. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us here on the Prison Pod. Let's see. I guess that's just about it. I want to let my listeners know that there will be links to all of the information we talked about today. And if you have any questions, you can send them to me, and I can relay them on to the people that are involved with the project.
Yes, please do. Please do. I would love to make myself available to anyone who has questions. And thank you so much for your interest in our project and chatting with me today. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Eric. I want to remind our listeners that we've been talking with Eric Seiferth, and we've been discussing this great exhibit in New Orleans called Captive State. If you have an opportunity to go and see it, make sure to stop by because it's all about learning the truth.
You have been listening to The Prison Pod, a podcast not just for those in prison but for anyone who has been affected by incarceration. Ms. Valerie would love for you to write to her with your questions, comments, and show ideas. The address is Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine. 04473.